So it's come to this, hasn't it? You and I looking at each other on a screen. You, my past, future. Nice to meet you. So I hope if you watch the first video of this that your philosophical nose didn't bleed too bad. I was, it was interesting, the experience of reading that out loud into this strange listening that I'm speaking into right now. I don't really quite know what to make of it, right? Like somehow I have a sense of you, whoever you are listening to this right now. And in some sense, what's calling forth this word right now is you, the listener. But I haven't met most of you. I mean, I've met some of you. And by the way, you're lovely, in case you were wondering. I think you're lovely. But the fact that I'm speaking at all, right, is given by a listening. And there's this listening I'm speaking into. And it's such a strange relationship because I kind of, as I'm talking, I have this familiarity with you, but yet I haven't really met you. But our whole lives have come down to this moment. Everything has led to this moment with you and I sitting here with this strange relationship. So, in the spirit of continuing that relationship, let's read some Heidegger. Okay, so we got through all of 2 paragraphs, the first reading. And if it's possible to summarize this, I mean, the gist of what I'm hearing, and it's by no means the exhaust. I'm not at all exhausting, right? All that's being said in these 2 paragraphs by any stretch of the imagination. But what I'm kind of getting from this and hearing is that essentially that to really, if you're really going to practice philosophy and engage with philosophy, you're doing it from the deepest, most essential, like existential bone marrow, if you will, right? That what philosophy, what it isn't, right, is something that just kind of exists out there and then we ask questions about it. No, it's in the question of philosophy when it's asked. It's through that for which it begins to disclose itself to you, right? And that very disclosure and the understandings that ensue in that relationship, right, is similar to being in an intimate relationship or a deep friendship with somebody, that the process of understanding that person and coming to know that person is the same process by which you are changed in that relationship. So in some sense, he's in these first couple of paragraphs, I hear him calling to the depth of that, right? As he says, in this first paragraph, like, it's kind of all right here. If we invest everything without exception in this questioning and do not merely act as if we are questioning while still believing we possess our reputed truths, right? So, and this is one of the things about what's interesting about philosophy too, is, in some sense you do learn things, right? Like you learn in engaging with philosophy, you learn what Kant says, right? You learn what Levinas says, right? You learn in some sense there's understandings that they come up with and their unique theories on things and their ideas. However, the process of engaging those ideas, right, to really engage them, I think in the way Heidegger is egging us on, encouraging us, challenging us to do, is that when you learn, you simultaneously learn, right, that by which you were seeing with, right? Like in getting other possibilities of that these philosophical distinctions disclose, in some sense, in another way of saying that is, in learning that, you simultaneously unlearn something else, right? There's like, in comprehending, right, being, it's kind of a recollecting that is a remembering that you have forgot something deep. So there's this kind of death process, right, in some sense. And you could maybe say that these, what dies in the ongoing grappling with asking the fundamental questions, right, and this disclosure of philosophy that arises through this deep questioning, right? What's some of the things that die, right, when something else opens up? It are these unquestioned truths, right? And then, so he says in this last sentence of the second paragraph, on the contrary, the pure dispassion of thought is at bottom only the most rigorous maintenance of the highest disposition, the one open to the uniquely uncanny fact that there are beings rather than not, right? So, I think he's naming that. I think implicitly he's naming that we oftentimes think about philosophical thinking, right, as a kind of detached, disembodied objectivity, if you will. But what he's saying is that deep objectivity is already a disposition, and it's a disposition of the deepest order. By disposition, right, there's that sense of being in an embodied position that's already in a world, right? So in other words, in really engaging philosophically is to be touched down to the bone by it, right? At the very core of the place from which you stand. Let it shake you. And let it reveal, in some sense, the uncanniness of that there are beings at all, right? And rather not nothing. In some sense, Heidegger maybe didn't like what I just said. Let me turn that back on. There we go. Sorry about that. Okay. So I'm just going to go on to the third paragraph. And I'll go ahead and just read the whole paragraph, and then we can go back to it. If we had to say something immediately about the basic disposition of philosophy, i.e., of futural philosophy, what do you mean by futural philosophy? We might call it restraint. In it, two elements originally belong together and are as one. Terror in the face of what is closest and most obtruse, namely that beings are, and awe in the face of what is remotest, namely that in beings and before each being. Let me fix this. This is strange. Sorry about that. There's a storm going on here, so I think we're getting little surges, and my little lamps are apparently pretty sensitive to that. So I'm just going to start from the top of this paragraph again. If we had to say something immediately about this basic disposition of philosophy, right? So disposition, the place, you could say the proper place from which to ask the basic question of philosophy, right? If we had to say something immediately about this basic disposition of philosophy, i.e. a futural philosophy. We're going to come back and talk about what that could mean. I'm not exactly sure. A futural philosophy. We might call it restraint. In it, two elements are in it, i.e. the disposition of philosophy. In it, two elements originally belong together and are as one. One of the elements is terror in the face of what is closest and most obtrusive, namely that beings are, and awe in the face of what is remotest, namely that in beings, and before each being holds sway. Restraint is the disposition in which this terror is not overcome and set aside, but is precisely preserved and conserved through awe. Restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being, the capital B, being itself, not beings. And in it, the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most worthy of questioning. Only one who throws himself into the all-consuming fire of the questioning of what is most worthy of questioning has the right to say more of the basic disposition than its elusive name. Yet, once he has wrested from himself this right, he will not employ it, but will keep silent. For all the more reason, the basic disposition should never become an object of mere talk. For example, in the popular and rash claim that what we are now teaching is a philosophy of restraint. So that last part, right? For example, in the popular and rash claim that what we are now teaching is a philosophy of restraint. In other words, don't take what I'm doing, what I hear him say, don't take what I'm doing and just make representations about it. And then think that those representations that you possess it in some sense. And then you can go to your cocktail parties and talk about that we're in the age of restraint. He's saying, no, this is not an understanding that you can grasp with your, your cogito, your as a subject, like grasping an object, right? And then you can gossip about it or something, or own it, or take it over, or no, he's talking about something that we are already in that we can find ourselves in the grip of it, that is withdrawals from our most common understanding. That the disposition of philosophy that we want to engage in, right, is, and in some sense, in another place, Heidegger talks about, like, perhaps it'd be a good idea that that we could stand before what isn't immediately intelligible, but still have to listen, right? So he's asking us to tune in and listen to something here, right? And not demand that it be immediately intelligible, but to still have to listen. To still have to listen is something like to stand in the basic disposition of philosophy. So let's go through this like each sentence and see if we can kind of hear more of this. If we had to say something immediately about the basic disposition of philosophy, i.e. a futural philosophy, we might call it restraint. Okay, so what is he taught? I mean, this is interesting. It's like, what is he getting at by futural philosophy? So I don't know, but what I'm imagining that if we think about the future in the ecstatic temporal sense that he talks about in Being in Time, right? It is the future and possibilities, the horizons of possibilities, that is most determinate of ourselves, right? And and in some sense, like that's kind of opposite of what the common sense understanding of the matter is. It's usually we think about it like it is our past and remembering ourselves and our identities that we get through that past that is most determining. But but the but the way that Heidegger talks about time is actually Dasein comes into being before its future. Its future, in some sense, calls it out into care to take over these possibilities. So, what is most determinant of us is not the actual, but the possible. So, he's saying, so if we kind of think about it like that, that the basic disposition of philosophy, i.e., of futural philosophy, we might call it restraint. So, futural philosophy, in other words, it must be a philosophy that is touching into the realm of possibility, of a future, and that the disposition, whatever this disposition is that we undergo, is in relationship to what is most determinate of us. So, this futural philosophy, if the future is what's most determinate of our being, then a futural philosophy is a philosophy on precisely what is going to be most determinate of us. Okay, and then he says we might call this disposition restraint. So let's see what he means by this. In it, i.e., in restraint, the basic disposition of philosophy, two elements originally belong together and are as one. So one element is terror in the face of what is closest and most obtrusive, namely, that beings are, and awe in the face of what is remotest, namely, that in beings and before each being holds sway. Okay, so I think we want to get at this first by talking about being holds sway, right? So, in some sense, and you hear a lot of people talk about this, right? That in some sense, the only thing Heidegger is ever getting at is the question of being, right? Is the remembering of the core question that's at the center of our being. It's at the center of everything, right? Which is being itself, the being of beings, being itself. And in some sense, Heidegger in many places talks about the whole all of Western philosophy, in some sense, since its inception, has been the process of a forgetfulness of this most uncanny, obscure being itself. That it's in some sense been taken for granted. It's not actually been confronted, looked at. The question of being is been forgotten. So in some sense, Heidegger hears the call of that which is most concealed, right? Being holds sway, right? And what he wants to pick up the question of the meaning of being, the very original conceptual question, right? In the very early pre-Socratic philosophers, right? So, but what do we mean by being? Right? In some sense, if you think about it, this is one way of getting at this strange sense. So, as he says, namely that in beings and before each being, i.e., namely in beings and before each being. So a being, not being itself, but a being before each beings. You could say everything that you've ever encountered is a being, including yourself. Thoughts are beings, right? Background, vague senses of being a self, right, is a being, right? This table's a being, everything's a being. Yet being as such, right, isn't a being. Being as such is something like the through line that runs through everything, right? And gathers itself as beings. But this, you could say, this through line being itself isn't one of the beings it gathers to be. To question that, right, is to question something that by definition can't be disclosed as a being, and everything that we know is a being. Yet what constitutes beings as beings, its being, right, is never one of those disclosures as a being. Yet, in order to comprehend any being at all, we must in some sense have an understanding of this being. But when you try to bring it into view, it becomes a being and it conceals. So, I mean, there's many other ways of getting at this, right? But this is one way to start to look at the uncanniness of being, because it's the most, in some sense, it's, as he says over here, in order to see being, or that being holds sway, the being of beings, right? There's a basic disposition that we must be gripped by, if you will, and it's it's in two elements originally belonging together and are as one. So one element is terror in the faces of what is closest and most obtrusive, namely that beings are, and awe in the face of what is remotest, namely that in beings and before each being holds sway. So, okay. So let's see if we can start to get at this element. So in it, two elements originally belong together and are as one. Okay, one, terror in the face of what is closest and most obtrusive, namely that beings are. Okay, so in some sense, he's getting at this sense in which, so everything is, but what of this is itself? This is itself never becomes one of the things that are, right? So in some sense, it's the furthest away. Like we can't ever grasp hold of it. So it's like the most concealed. Yet but whatever this being itself is simultaneously what on some level, and it's probably the deepest level of our being, we have a pre-thematic understanding that affords it to disclose as beings, but it conceals itself as being. So in some sense, this understanding of being is what's most near. It's like kind of, it's closer to ourselves. This being of being is closer to ourselves than ourselves. So in that sense, to confront it, right, is to, in some sense, be in terror in the face of what is closest, is most obtrusive, right? But again, here's the thing. It's closest and most obtrusive. In order to understand anything at all, we must have an understanding of is as such, right? So in that sense, it's what presupposes and is before and foreshadows everything, is this understanding of being itself, that which holds sway, right? That which gathers all beings as beings and shows themselves as beings, right? Being itself, however, isn't one of those beings, but that the way we understand that being, the way it is in us, is the thing that's closer to ourselves than ourselves. right? Therefore, to awaken in the disposition of it is to find yourself in this uncanny, weird situation, to say the least, of that which is most familiar, right? The closest in is the most obscure. That's you. That's why you kind of walk around kind of existentially, kind of like Bambi on ice all the time, kind of self-conscious and awkward and not quite sure who you are and how you know yourself at the same time that you're being yourself, and other people look at you and you're like, I'm okay, you're okay, not that's you. And what he's saying is to awaken to that is one awakens that through a mood of a kind of terror. And it's closer to ourselves than ourselves, right? And it's closest and most obtruse, most invasive, right? And here's the other part, namely that beings are. And the other part, so one element is terror, the other one is awe, in the face of what is remotest, namely that in beings and before each being holds sway, right? So you could say terror, I would imagine, I think what he's talking about, that in the basic disposition of these two elements that are as one, the terror element, I think you could say something like the view of the being of beings from the innermost sense of being inside of it, right? It's like if being was a, I've heard somebody make this analogy, I can't remember who it was, but like if being was a ball, there's one element which is knowing it from its innermost center, right? And then there's knowing the ball from outside of the ball. So I think terror is something like the view from the innermost sense of being. And what you find is being itself is most obscure, but yet most obtrusive, most near, most, like this. And that's the terror sense. And the mood of awe discloses, let's see what he says here. And in awe, in the face of what is remotest, i.e., being, namely that in beings, anything that you've ever dealt with, and before each being holds sway. That which is most near, that is terrifying to and obtrusive and most familiar to us, is somehow holding sway over everything, right? But yet it itself never fully discloses itself as a being, yet it constituting all beings as such. That's the sense. All right, let's go to the next sentence here. So restraint is the disposition in which this terror is not overcome and set aside, but is precisely preserved and conserved through awe. Interesting. So restraint is the disposition in which this terror is not overcome and set aside, but is precisely preserved and conserved through awe. Okay. So, I mean, I guess one way of getting at this is, so through awe, all of this comes together in restraint. Or restraint affords awe to gather this most terrifying element and this most awe-invoking element. Restraint is the disposition in which this terror is not overcome. Okay, so what would be overcoming the terror? Well, I think it'd be something like our normal way of representing things, right? Where we don't actually confront the being of beings or being itself. We instead represent it to ourselves and make it an object and stand outside of it, right? And then look at it and then have a whole metaphysics about it or something, or theorize about it. That would be something like overcoming it and setting it aside. So restraint is the disposition which this tear is not overcome. So we're not overcoming the tear and setting it aside, but is precisely preserved and conserved through awe. Okay. So it's important. So what he's saying is that there's something right about this terror and this awe, right? In fact, it's so right, we need to, that it's in some sense, the terror and the awe are disclosive of being itself, that's what we have to come into relationship with if we are to come into relationship with being, right? Is through this terror and this awe. And that, so the work here and the disposition is not to set that aside, not to overcome it through our theorizing about it, through our metaphysics, through all that stuff, but is precisely, we want to preserve and conserve it through awe. Okay. So now let's go to the next sentence. Restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being, and in it, the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most worthy of questioning. Okay, so I'll read that again. Restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being. So in other words, these two elements, restraint, is the disposition of philosophy, right? This conserving and preserving of awe and terror, of what is most near and furthest away, and determining, i.e. being. Okay, so restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being. So this is our relation to being. This is us being intimate with being. So if we don't put it aside, but we conserve and preserve it, we are conserving and preserving in the engagement with the fundamental, intimate, immediate relationship with being itself. This is the way it discloses itself. Notice that there's nothing, we're not talking about objects here, right? We're talking about something we're living out. It's a disposition, okay? Restraint is the basic position of the relation of being, and in it, the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most worthy of questioning. So here's this interesting thing. So what does he mean by concealment, right? Like, because don't we normally know anything because it's revealed, right? Like we come to know something, we come to know it's revealed to us, it's disclosed to us, it's shown to us, it's lit up, we can point to it, we can go, we can know things about it. But what he's saying here is that being itself, that which holds sway through all beings, right, which is most closest to you and furthest away, right? Restraint is the basic disposition of the relation to being, and in it the concealment, right? But he's talking about it. He's bringing in concealment is essential, right? So, and in it the concealment of the essence of being becomes what is most worthy of questioning. So this way that this paradoxical sense where being withdrawals yet is most obtruse to us, right? That when we preserve and conserve this basic disposition through terror and awe, we come in direct relation with being, and that direct relation, right, is, I don't know if you want to say, housed in the concealment of the essence of being, and in that concealment becomes what is most worthy of questioning. So that that thing that we can't ever make a being, i.e., being, right? And its concealment from us and through us and as us, we can then begin to, it becomes open to be questioned. Bingo. That which is concealed becomes essentially most worthy of questioning. All right. Okay, this video is getting kind of long, so let's just make it through this paragraph. He goes on, only one who throws himself into the all-consuming fire of the questioning of what is most worthy of questioning has the right to say more of the basic disposition that I'm sorry, let me read that again. It's kind of an awkward sentence. Only one who throws himself into the all-consuming fire of the questioning of what is most worthy of questioning has the right to say more of the basic disposition than is its elusive name. All right. So basically, it's only if you are willing to invest everything in the fire of this terror and awe, right, that you throw yourself into. Only one who throws himself into the all-consuming fire of the questioning of what is most worthy of questioning has the right, that grants you the right to say more of the basic disposition than its elusive name. So in other words, the basic disposition, right, is a name that doesn't represent, right? It perhaps points to something, but what it points to is something that's concealed and withdrawn. So in other words, throw yourself into this fire, but don't stand out and think that you have a handle on this. No. Let it burn you. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next sentence. Yet, once he has wrested for himself this right, he will not employ it, but will keep silent. So this is interesting. Yet, once he has wrested for himself this right, he will not employ it, but will keep silent. Okay, so what is to keep silent? I think what he's talking about is that we can't know being as a being. So things that we can talk about and chit-chat about is a concealment in some sense of being as such, right? But to really be with being itself is to keep silent, because that silence seems to comprehend in some basic, deep way the disposition in which being is through us and as us. It's something like that. Okay, now the last paragraph, or last sentence of the third paragraph. For all the more reason, the basic disposition should never become an object of mere talk, right? For example, in the popular and rash claim that what we are now teaching is a philosophy of restraint, right? So in other words, don't leave this video and go talk to your mother about, I'm in the philosophy of restraint, right? As if you know what you're talking about, right? No, be in the unsettledness. Let it touch you to the bone. The questioning and the fire touch you to the bone, right? In realizing that what you most are, right? What you most are and consumes and takes you over is nothing that you know how to name. what is most familiar to is what's most farther away, and it's what's most determinate of you. It's determining you right now, second by second by second. The disposition that you can come into that has you in a relationship to that is something that cannot be chit-chatted about, but is lived through, that one must keep silent about in the deepest sense of the word, to preserve the terror and the awe in the unified disposition of asking the basic question of philosophy.